decided now at university, it's a pleasure to announce and decided to have Bernard done as a honorary professor of the university for continuing these long-lasting relationships and work in the field of childhood disability. Please, our
we are honored to pass this certificate. We have the honor to award you the title Honor Professor Emeritus of the University.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for passing this. Now we come to the Bernard's letter.
Well, this is a great honor. Thank you. This is a story of friendship. It's an academic story also, but it's a story of friendship, of being together, of thinking together, of looking in the same direction and sharing what we feel and feeling together. And there's a lot of ethics in it, a lot of reflection about what the meaning is of what we're doing. And so I'm very happy to have this topic here, ethics. And it's good that it's a topic for each one of us. So you know that this is an emerging field and there are people who actually study ethics and that is their profession, they're ethicists. But my suggestion here is that ethics, clinical ethics, is for every one of us. Not very obvious, because when you look at the ethical literature and the journals specifically focusing on ethics, sometimes the articles are so difficult to understand. You understand most of the words, but not the sentences, because they're about concepts that seem to be beyond our grasp. But on the contrary, ethical thinking is everyday practice. This is my suggestion, and this is what I'm trying to share with you. It all started last night. A beautiful night. The moon came for a visit. There's a pointer. Yes, this. Look. So if the moon can give us this impression that we can be almost at the same level, and we know it's not true, this is very inviting. You see this crescent? And there we go. Now, I work at several universities, and now I'm an honorary professor of this medical university. Much of what I say was written in a book which we did together with clinicians and ethicists, and that is Ethics in Child Health. This was a very good exercise for all of us, and I learned so much. In the process of making this book, we realized that it was really important to get input from a parent. And we invited Jennifer Johansson, at the beginning as a collaborator and then as a co-author, because we learned so much from her. We said, Jen, you are not here to represent parents. You are here because of what you feel, of what you know, and she also studied ethics. And we realize how patronizing we tend to be, how much we tend to impose our thoughts, our way of seeing things. And the best things I learned is just to sit back, listen, take your time. Don't try to get the answer, but try to be together and move towards practical solutions. Now, what did I learn at our medical school, the first one I attended? Ethics was very easy. was say, first do no harm. Supposedly from the Hippocratic Oath, even though it doesn't say that. But that was a suggestion then. But ethics has become much more refined in the thinking. Now, still from the Greek old times, there was this notion, ethics was one of the three components of philosophy, and philosophy encompassed everything. You had these three departments, if you wish. You had the hard department of the egg, that was the shell, that was logic. And logic was all about wisdom, also assent, how we agree to think on a shared basis. And then you had the yolk of the egg was physics. And physics was not only about physics as we understand it now, but it was all about self-control and also desire. So if you read Aristotle about physics, or the old philosophers, it would be that. And then between the shell and the yolk, you would have the white of the stoic egg, and that was ethics. And ethics was about justice. So you couldn't have action. You couldn't know about desire, assent, without translating them into action. So ethics was something very practical and based on values, and these values were the value of justice at the time. Now, since then, in recent time, we developed bioethical principles, and I'm going to talk about these today. But the principles do not explain everything. Very often in the clinic we say, but what is the child's best interest? And this is not a principle. This is a standard. A principle is something that we can all share. A standard is a personal perception of, for example, the child's best interest. But if you ask the mother, if you ask the nurse, if you ask everyone in the team, we might not have a consensus about what the child's best interest is. And yet, this remains our guide. We're not going to do anything which diverges from the child's best interest, which is a supreme standard. But it's not very useful. Now, ethics is difficult, by definition. It is a part of morality, but common morality is not difficult. It speaks for itself. It doesn't even have to speak. It's the things that you feel they're right. You can discuss them, but it's not a very interesting discussion. In ethics, you have more complex moral problems. And a great exercise is to identify that these are problems. Say, oh yes, there is a question here. Now, we have more problems now than in the past? I'm not sure. But we have different manifestations of problems, and we also have new ways of seeing them. Why? Well, in childhood disability, because children with disabilities now become adults with disability. It did exist in the past, but it was more the exception than the rule. Now you do see adults with Duchenne. You see many adults with CP, including with complex CP. We also have advances in technology. That has been there since the ancient times. But we still have a fascination with technology, and we need to realize where we are, where we stand. And also cultural perception of the child in society. The child has become an actor, a focus. We listen to a child at the United Nations. This says a lot about our culture. This says a lot about are we really listening to children? But it is clear that there is a change here. Disability, as opposed to handicap, the relationship that we have with our patients, with the family, they have changed a great deal, including and very fast in Georgia, and the role of professionals, including interdisciplinarity, as we have in this room. Health, we think about health differently. The focus is much more about functioning than just looking at a situation as it is. Quality of life has become a genuine issue. And we are increasingly confronted with legal issues. Now, health, when the World Health Organization was founded, was defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, which was very important. But nowadays, even though this definition is still valid, the emphasis has been on function and on a notion that is not absolute, a notion that is centered on the person, on what is relevant to the person. So you, health professionals, are certainly not the only ones that can define a person's health. And so you can be healthy even with impairments. Look at us. Functioning, as opposed to just wondering what is wrong, as I learned at medical school. You know, this is not there, that is not working well. What is working well? How is it working? How is it relevant? How is it specifically relevant to this child and family and situation? The goals do not derive from a diagnosis, but from an individual situation. The intervention also. Now, quality of life is really important, and a few years ago we learned a lot when we started evaluating quality of life in specific groups. This is a study which came as a shock a few years ago, and this is asking teenagers with cerebral palsy, a group of children with cerebral palsy across Europe, and peers who do not have cerebral palsy, how they felt about a number of dimensions relating to quality of life. And what was really strong here in the results was showing that there was no marked difference in self-report of quality of life by children with cerebral palsy and children without cerebral palsy. This was termed the disability paradox. You can be disabled and yet have a life of good quality. This is really interesting, and do not take that as the ultimate truth. This does not imply that people with impairments, people with cerebral palsy, for example, have a high quality life. This does not imply that people with disabilities have a better life than people without disability. You may see that for some persons in some situations, but be aware that quality of life is something subjective, the way you, as a person, you evaluate it for yourself, and not your mother, and not your brother, and not your doctor, and not your therapist. It's interesting to discuss this, but do not over-project your own notion of quality of life. Legal rights is relevant to ethics, but not primarily. So ethical thinking, it should remain autonomous of legal issues. And then at some stage you still bump into legal issues. My personal definition of ethics is responsible transgression. You remember I said ethics is about complex problems, about difficult problems. So what I mean is, when you're into ethical thinking, you have a responsible freedom of not being constrained during your thinking by the line between what is right and what is wrong, because you do not know. And therefore, you're not bound by what is legal and what isn't. I'm not inviting you to break the law. I'm inviting you in the process to have that moment of freedom. Otherwise, you can't think ethically. It's not the law that is going to dictate to you what is ethical and not. But then, when you take your direction, see how you can be relevant. Relevant to your culture, relevant to the society, relevant to this situation. And always keep this question: whose needs are being served? Laws serve society. They're for us, but not as individuals, as people in a society. They're very important. They guarantee our freedoms. But in our approach, we also need to be personal and individual. As in all of our professions, and this is why we're sitting here all together, there's a lot that we have to do. I don't know if we were ever technicians, so knowing our art and then practicing our art within boundaries. But now we're all responsible for planning and implementing complex investigations and therapies. We all part of this very important of counseling. Childhood disability is certainly from fetal life now, which is difficult, through adolescence and through responsibility beyond adolescence. And so we are also responsible for transitioning towards adult care, adult service, if it exists or not, and project into the future. We are also social advocates. We can't be restricted to our practice. And we have new challenges, including evidence-based practice, including knowing about the new evidence and how to apply it in practice. And this is ethical practice. But when we wrote this, cerebral palsy science and clinical practice, the challenge was to make a good link between science, which is not so strong, and we need to admit that there is a lot we do not know, that we're not very far at all in childhood disability in the science and clinical practice. And so from evidence-based medicine, which we very rarely can do, we need to have at least evidence-informed practice. Ethical issues in practice and in research, and we also have to some extent, or at least a few of us, the responsibility to produce evidence. And at the same time, we are practitioners. There's some convergence, but there's no absolute convergence between these two. And so there is a tension between being a clinician and a researcher. But that's not very difficult to deal with. The hierarchy is clear. We always have the obligation to look for the patient. Sometimes it is possible, and when it is not possible, we need to be very clear about where we are and stop the second part. So we need to think that, well, these are words, and it sounds easy, but children with disabilities are particularly vulnerable for many aspects, including being involved into research. And don't forget that despite all the interdisciplinarity and the respect we show for children and families, there's still some cultural polarity, and we're still presented as people who have the knowledge and perhaps should be trusted. And yet, I think that we ought to retain now, this might change in the future, some mild paternalism. I do not want us to escape our responsibility. This is a notion that is important, the technological imperative. What does this notion of imperative mean? It means that if something can be done, then it must be done. If I have this new genetic test, if there is this MRI, if there's this stem cell treatment emerging, if there's that new drug, if there's that even therapy, I must do it because it's there. We must realize that it is not so. We must realize it in our life. We don't have to have the latest smartphone and the latest this and the latest that. But when it comes to ethics, it's really important to remember this question: whose needs are being served? Is the child going to be helped by a new MRI? Going to be helped by being sent to Turkey or to the United States for this or that investigation or treatment? Is this what it's all about? I said we need to produce evidence, but is it at the price of the child? Perhaps not. So I don't think that technology reduces our responsibility. It's not because we have access to MRI that it makes our clinical responsibility any easier. Advocacy, support of lay and patients' organization, and I have learned so much from the Georgian example. Education of the public, and we were not trained for that. Guidance, anticipating, and also whistleblowing, recently with vaccination, and so many other topics. Now, loads of ethical dilemmas, and I take these examples just to show that it's not just life or death issues. And this is about dilemmas, that is questions. But I believe that ethical thinking is more than just decisions. Here, a family repeatedly fails to keep clinic appointment, and so after 3, 4 times, 2 times, the child didn't come. You say, well, okay, no come, no come. They won't be allowed to come anymore. Can we do that? There is a dilemma, and perhaps you didn't identify it, but now you will. Perhaps it was automatic, but now you realize, well, there's an issue here. A family demands extra therapy for their child, and the evidence makes it unreasonable. This happens all the time, doesn't it? Members of a family disagree with one another about a recommended approach to clinical management issue, making further action difficult. The dad says, well, he must have this surgery. The mum says, oh, no way, or the other way around. Or not the dad and the mum. How do you deal with it? Professionals disagree among themselves about a proposed course of action. The occupational therapy says, well, this must be done. And the physio says, oh, no. And the orthopedic surgeon has their own idea. How do you keep concentrated on one child? Due to long waiting lists, a 1-year-old child with suspected neurological problem has to wait many months for assessment or intervention. You may say, well, this is not ethical, this is just a reality. Yes, the reality poses ethical challenges. That child with autism, that child with a neurodegenerative condition, that child with any condition requiring early intervention. If you think that early intervention is important, then early detection is important. Do I have a solution? No, there's no general solution, but it's good to highlight where we are and take a role there. How do you deliver bad news? There are also ethical issues there. Now, how do we deal with them? With what we know, with what we've done. This is a very useful question. You may not have a personal experience with all of these questions, but very often you will have had. So what did I do then? And this is based on probably 3 dimensions. One is the obligations. The obligations is the laws, but also the rules of your institutions, for example. What do the rules say? Maybe it's not enough, but it's helpful. It's helpful to know where you stand. Ideals. Ideals are the values. The values of your institutions, but also your personal values, your personal goals, and your consequences. So think, really, so what would happen if I go this way, and think about it in just one dimension, good or bad. What good would happen, what bad would happen. But then we much more help if we couldn't solve it with the previous 3 dimensions. We have the 4 principles of bioethics that were suggested a while ago, and that not only do no harm, this is this one, but also do good, and increasingly respect the patient's autonomy. And also a principle of justice. See that word from the ancient Greeks, and we'll see what it is. These principles, there's no hierarchy between them. So you can't say, well, first do autonomy. And if I've respected the autonomy, then I can think of doing good. And then I can think of the next one. No. They do not provide you with answers. They provide you with frameworks. We say it's complex, I'm going to address it in a structured way within those principles. And they serve for dialogue. Respect for autonomy is the right to make your own choices. Whose autonomy are we talking about? The child's. Now, you may say that the child is not competent. Yes, very often children with disabilities are not competent. But this is not a legal issue. It is not because they're underage. So we're still talking about the child, and the child is often the best representative of themselves. But often it is not the same, and it's not easy, and so somebody else does it, who typically the parents. But sometimes you may feel that the parents are not representing that child's interest or autonomy well, whose interests are being served. Choices based on understanding, so informed consent, very, very important. Then do good, and do good includes prevention. There the patient's interest is very clear. Do good is also means in practice do more good than harm, then do no harm. Also, if you do not do anything, that would be do no harm. And it's not the same as do good. We can take examples in the discussion that we can, informal discussions that we can have later over coffee or here. Quality of life, and then justice, a fair distribution of resources. That is, spending the whole day with a single patient is unethical because there aren't so many of you, and you are required for another child and for another child and for another child. And fair distribution within the system of healthcare professionals. And what is fair? Well, again, you need to think. How do you think it's based on need and resources? How do you adapt resources to need? And there's certainly no universal answer. In Tbilisi, the answer is probably different from in another setting, or within Tbilisi in one setting than in another setting. Now, I'm going to skip over this. There are people who say, well, principles are a bit rigid. I'm happy with them. But there are other ways of seeing things. But what I want to say, and these are really my ideals, it is what we do. Every day we have ethical issues. Every day we engage in ethical reflection, and it's one more way of engaging between us in interdisciplinarity. How does it work? It is based on respect and trust. And sometimes you feel that there is a lack of trust. Well, the issue, the challenge is to rebuild at least enough space for trust. Here, we need empathy. We need to understand the other, no, not even understand, be able to project ourselves in the other. Know that we're aiming for solutions. We need to take our time, and the solutions, we mustn't be too ambitious. It's not to solve everything, but we need to make progress with humility. Now, it's based on the observed science, like the rest of your clinical practice. It's based on collecting facts, objective facts, empirical data, just the same as the rest of your practice. And just like all what you do as a clinician, you make a situational judgment based on what we must recognize is always somewhat incomplete knowledge and somewhat conjecturing. It serves for decision making, which means that you need to take decisions, and perhaps you don't realize that in your practice. But then think, where do I have to take a decision? Where do we have to take a decision? Where is the question? Identify the question. Inscribe this in time. Don't hope that everything will be solved in one day. You say, okay, today we're meeting, and then we meet again tomorrow, or we meet again next week. And you move like that. So if one thing is too difficult, my suggestion is postpone it. You say so. Okay, I feel that this is really too emotional. We can't manage to discuss it. This, and we'll discuss it later. You'll see it will come later, and it will work. So please do not understand too quickly. It's clinical encounters, and it's all about narratives. It's storytelling, and I think that a lot in clinical practice is storytelling. Based on individual situations, don't generalize, don't say this diagnosis and therefore that. All this truth, plural form, many truths in one situation relate to one situation. Multiple realities. And at the end of this process, don't expect everybody to be on the same page for everything, but be practical and pragmatic. And this egg accommodated the way you want. So work with it. And I had a taste of Georgian gastronomy yesterday, and I see that you're well prepared for this. Thank you.